This episode is brought to you by The Legend of the Kasike Princess by Michael Dorta. Follow Caraya, a Taíno warrior transported to modern-day Boriquén, as she battles to protect her ancestral home from new threats. Perfect for readers young and old, it's a journey of courage, love, and rediscovery. Available on Amazon in English y en español. Pick up your copy today and reconnect with the rich legacy of our Taíno people. Mabrika! Welcome to this special presentation of Taíno culture. I'm Priscilla Colon, co-founder and creative here at Kasarito, where our mission is to promote the Taíno language and culture. Now, as I started to prepare this presentation, I realized that I needed to take a huge step back and really think about what decolonization actually means. Because you see, decolonizing is not something that happens outside of ourselves. True decolonization happens in our minds and bodies, allowing our souls to be free of these self-imposed shackles. So before we talk about Taíno female chiefs, we must first look at how deeply ingrained our own biases are against females in leadership positions. Let's take a look at some of the stories that we've heard about women. Take a close look at this painting. Who is the woman in the picture? What is the story you've heard about her? Well, if you grew up in any Judeo-Christian household, you know that the woman in the picture is Eve from the Garden of Eden, and she's often the subject of very negative portrayals. I was curious to know what ChatGPT knows about Eve, and the results are not surprising, unfortunately. The adjectives that ChatGPT used to describe Eve included temptress, seductress, deceptive, weak, gullible, disobedient, rebellious, the source of original sin. Now, what do these adjectives say about our mother? Supposedly the woman we all come from. What do they say about women in general? Would these be the kinds of characteristics you would want to see in a leader? But the story of Eve is just that, a story. Let's take a look at another painting. Does anyone know who this woman is? Well, let me tell you who she is. This is Sky Woman. Sky Woman is from the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois origin stories. When I asked ChatGPT to describe Sky Woman, it talked about the interconnectedness of nature and humanity, balance and nurturing. And the adjectives that it used to describe Sky Woman: sacred, creator, transformative, nurturing, harmonious, wise, resilient, generous, and the source of life. Now, I want to introduce you to the mother of creation in Taíno origin stories. This is a painting of her created by Taíno bohique or spiritual leader Miguel Sagué Jr. Atabey, also known as Atabex or Atabesh or Atabeira, is the central figure in Taíno cosmology. Atabey is the feminine aspect of Yaya, Great Spirit, and the words used to describe her include sacred feminine, mother of creation, protector of life, nurturing, the being of fertility. She governs the waters. She is a healer. She is divine authority. But she also has a dual nature. Because you see, Atabey is not just the creator, but when things aren't going right, she will come in and sweep everything away with the hurricanes to ensure that new life grows in a better way. So she's got that dual nature, which means she is in harmony with everything. Everything is in balance. Now imagine, what kind of leader would Atabey make? She'd probably be one that is very diplomatic because she would understand all sides. So what happened in 1492? One of my favorite quotes comes from Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. And then they met, the offspring of Sky Woman, in this case Atabey, and the children of Eve. And the land around us bears the scars of that meeting, the echoes of our stories. So we're talking about a clash of worldviews that spans thousands of years back to our origin stories, and the repercussions are unimaginable. So who were the children of Atabey? We need to establish the context of who the Taínos were before pre-colonization for a couple of reasons. Most people have never heard of Taínos because they were the first people of contact in 1492. They experienced the brunt of colonization, the onslaught and brutality. Also, the Spanish declared the Taínos extinct around the mid to late 1500s, so in the eyes of the laws, Taínos don't exist. Those who have heard of Taínos believe only the colonizers' perspectives, what they left in their documents, which is that Taínos were naive, docile, like children, that they just romped around the tropical forests half naked, and so that in Columbus's own words, they would make good slaves. Modern-day Taíno academics are using an interdisciplinary approach to find out what Taíno society was actually like. What if we could apply the same methods to explore our female ancestors? In 1975, Puerto Rican historian Jalil Sued Badillo tried to do the same. He published The Indigenous Woman and Her Society. Coincidentally, 1975 was also declared by the UN International Women's Year. He highlighted the connection with all indigenous people in Abya, the mature land. He wanted to establish the fact that we are all connected, and he used historical and contemporary evidence of his time to prove not only women's roles in Taíno society, but also women's roles as chiefs. He began by asking the question, were female leaders common? And the answer is yes, especially in matrilineal societies. In these societies, people trace their families through their maternal lines. These societies are organized into clans, which are groups of related families. The husband usually joins his wife's clan, and the children belong to the mother's clan. And the clan leaders are none other than the grandmothers. Among the Seneca and Tuscarora of North America, they have an origin story where their first chief was a woman. In modern-day Colombia and Venezuela, you have indigenous people who also historically had many female chiefs before and after colonization. Historian Jalil Sued Badillo was able to uncover the names of 36 female chiefs on the island of Haiti, shared by Haiti and the Dominican Republic, from a 1514 distribution of Santo Domingo. Now you see, under the horrific encomienda system, Taíno lands and the peoples themselves were distributed among the Spaniards who became their new owners. This list of distribution shows the female chiefs and their Taínos, their family members, who they oversaw. Now, we don't know if this was a complete list for that year. We don't know how many female chiefs would have existed before the Spanish began documenting them. However, this list stands as a testament that female chiefs existed. In Boriquén, modern-day Puerto Rico, the historian uncovered the names of 13 female chiefs. Gathering this list was no easy task. He had to dig through legal documents where many female chiefs are mentioned offhand, in passing. Mostly these legal documents were disputes between the Spaniards, who wanted to claim ownership of the Taínos. And in some cases, as we will soon see, their names were deliberately erased because they were female leaders. But 4 years later, in 1979, archaeologist Ricardo Alegria was quoted as saying, "There's no definitive evidence that before the arrival of the Spanish conquistadors, there were women carrying out the functions of chiefs. It's possible that the Spanish imposed their hereditary concepts on the indigenous society and called the principal women of the Taíno leaders Kasíke, aka female chief, and that upon the chief's death, The Spanish then elevated his widow or principal wife to the office of chief. But who was Ricardo Alegría? Well, he happens to have been the father of modern-day Puerto Rican archaeology. He was the first director of the Institute of Puerto Rican Culture, and his words carried a lot of weight. So that's where the debate began. However, he was ignoring all of the historical and contemporary evidence of his time. Because of Ricardo Alegría's words, by the early 1980s, people began to question whether Taíno women had been chiefs before colonization. They said that this was the idea that came from hardcore feminists of the 60s and 70s, and they said that it was the Spanish, not Taínos, who made women chiefs as a way to control Taíno society. The subtext is that Taíno women were gullible, weak, and easily controlled. Women were the downfall of the entire Taíno society? Does that story seem familiar? Of course, that's the story of Eve. It's incredibly familiar to our people, because one of the first things imposed by the Spanish was Catholicism, as a way to erase our beliefs, our history, and our stories. But what if it's not just the stories that colonize our minds? What if it's the very language that is being used that's the real weapon? One of my favorite quotes comes from the sci-fi film Arrival. Language is the foundation of civilization. It is the glue that holds a people together. It is the first weapon drawn in conflict. And new research is bearing this out. Spanish and German speakers were asked to describe a bridge. Spanish speakers use words like long and strong, while German speakers use words like beautiful and elegant. Why would they use such different words to describe the same object? Well, Spanish and German are gendered languages. So the Spanish speakers view bridge as a male or masculine words, so their adjectives were quote-unquote masculine, while the German speakers view bridge as a feminine or female word, so they use quote-unquote feminine adjectives to describe the same bridge. In fact, this happened when Spanish imposed their gender norms through the Spanish language. So let's take a look at a few words that were from the Taíno language that became gendered when they were integrated or translated into Spanish. Yaya, for example, means the Great Spirit, but when it was translated into Spanish, it became El Gran Espíritu, acquiring that masculine gender. Bohique, which is shaman, spiritual leader, or healer, became El Boique, again acquiring that masculine gender. And Kasike, chief, became El Kasíke, again acquiring a masculine gender. So in this way, it became ingrained into the public consciousness, if you spoke Spanish, that Kasike, Bohique, and Yaya are either all males or roles associated with men, which is actually not true because these words were gender neutral in the original Taíno language. But Ricardo Alegría was right about one thing. The Spanish created the word la casica, referring to a female chief, as a way to integrate a concept that didn't exist in their worldview. It was obvious that female chiefs were not an unusual phenomenon. It required new language. But what does the word casique actually mean? When we break down this word into three parts, we believe that it means the head, point, or leader of the land. And we have evidence from indigenous relatives. In the Arawak language of Guyana, there are three words that are very similar to cacique. Caciquan means to have a home, to be the owner of a home, to be the head of a household. And caciquali, for males, and caciquaro, for females, means the owner of a home, the person who occupies a home and is the head of a household. Last year, I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Antonio Curet, the curator of the Smithsonian's Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. And he's been working for 20 years to answer one question: do we really understand what cacique means? He's been conducting research at the Thebes Indigenous Ceremonial Center, trying to find out who was the cacique. For example, was there somebody who owned more land, who had a bigger house, who had more beautiful adornments? But everything that he's found so far has pointed to one thing: that Taínos were an egalitarian society based on kinship systems with a cacique or head of household. So what happened when our Taíno ancestors faced these new people who arrived to their shores with a very different idea of how society should function? Their responses and approaches changed as circumstances changed for both men and female leaders. Today, I want to share with you the stories of 3 Taíno female chiefs, who I'm dubbing the lover, the diplomat, and the warrior, due to the 3 different approaches they took to dealing with the Spanish invasion. But the intention behind their actions was the same: saving their people. Let's begin with the lover, Kasike Ozema. I call her this for the way in which she welcomed Spaniards. Her yucayeque, or village, was where modern-day Santo Domingo, the capital of the Dominican Republic, is. And there is no coincidence. Santo Domingo was placed on top of her yucayeque, her village. We first hear about Kasike Ozema from the chronicler Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo, and this comes from around 1495. Fleeing from La Isabela, they went up the coast until they arrived where the city of Santo Domingo is currently situated, and they stopped in this settlement because they found an Indian village. Miguel Diaz became friends with the chief, who was later renamed Catalina, and in time they had 2 children. You see, Miguel Diaz had gotten into a fight with another Spaniard, badly injuring him, and the Spanish were not happy. He was fleeing from his own people. As he's fleeing, he happens to run into a Taíno village, led by Kasike Ozema. She took in the fugitive Spaniard Miguel Diaz. Now, some of you might be thinking, how could she? She's a traitor. She took in this Spaniard. Well, first, our Taíno ancestors had no idea who the Spaniards were, what was coming. And remember, their entire society was built on relationships, kinship systems. If a neighbor comes to you asking to borrow a cup of sugar or for help, you don't greet them with a volley of arrows. Kasike Ozema was not the only one dubbed as a quote-unquote lover. Famously, Kasike Juisa of Boriquén, Puerto Rico, was known to have had a relationship with a black conquistador. And because of these relationships, these women have been painted with a broad brush, saying that they were weak or gullible or coerced. But when we do that, we deny them their own agency. They made choices based on the information they had at the time, just like all of us would have. Let's turn now to the diplomat, Kasike Anacaona. Kasike Anacaona is probably one of the most famous Taíno chiefs, whether male or female. She was born in Yaguana, the capital of Jaragua, which is present-day Leogán, Haiti, around 1474. She was a great poet, composing many of the songs and stories for the ceremonies called areito. Kasike Anacaona was from the matrilineal chief's line of Jaragua. She married Caonabo, chief of Maguana, essentially uniting these 2 families. Now, there is a story that is conveniently left out of the public narrative because it doesn't align with the perspective of Taínos as a docile people. After Columbus crash-landed on the island of Haiti, he realized they had wrecked the Santa Maria. He left a contingent of 39 men while he sailed back to Spain. These men began pillaging and raping Taíno women. Caonabo and his fighters slaughtered them. When Columbus came back, all the Spaniards were dead and their settlement, La Navidad, had been burned to the ground. You can imagine that Caonabo became enemy number 1. Caonabo was arrested in 1494 and died in 1496. At that point, Kasike Anacaona became advisor to her brother Boichio, who established a relative peace with the Spaniards. And in 1500, Anacaona became chief of Jaragua and principal chief of the island. Now, this relative peace lasted about 6 years, but in 1503, the Spanish governor Nicolás de Obando said he had heard rumors of a Taíno revolt. Let's hear what Bartolomé de las Casas says about the massacre of 1503. The governor arrived one day with 60 men on horseback and more than 300 infantrymen, and through treachery he convinced more than 300 lords to enter a large house made of straw. Once inside, he ordered the place set on fire, and they were burned alive. All the others, as well as an infinite number of people, were run through with swords, and as an honor, the great lady Anacaona was hanged. Now, was Anacaona a fool for inviting the Spanish for peace talks? No, she had no reason not to trust them after 6 years of relative peace. And she wasn't the only cacique to try to establish alliances with the Spaniards. Kasike Guayerbas I, a male chief, famously established an alliance with the Spaniards when they first arrived in Boriquén. He participated in a guaitiao ceremony with Ponce de León, who would later become the Spanish governor. This was a ceremony of friendship or brotherhood. Due to her amazing strength of character, today Anacaona is memorialized through statues, books, movies, songs, and so much more. Her spirit of diplomacy lives on. Now, let's learn about the warrior, Kasike Guayerbas. Kasike Guayerbas has the distinction of having her name almost completely erased from history. She is from the region of Otoao, called Utuado today, and it is located in the center of the island of Boriquén, Puerto Rico. By the early 1500s, the Taíno people of Boriquén were fed up with the Spanish. You see, the diplomatic alliances between the Taínos and the Spanish had crumbled. Now, Guayerbas II, the original Guayerbas's brother, who had taken over as cacique or chief, united many of the families and declared war against the Spaniards. The Spanish-Taíno War lasted almost 2 decades, and Kasike Guayerbas was a key participant in this war. Her fighters were associated with the burning of Caparra, the first Spanish capital of Boriquén. Now, the Taíno chiefs who participated in this war were tracked and captured, and we hear about Kasike Guayerbas from one of the chroniclers, who stated, "They captured alive 16 great lords and one great lady by the name of Guayerbas." The historian Jalil Sued Badillo believes that her name was systematically erased from history, and then later her gender was changed. When I asked ChatGPT to tell me about Kasike Guayerbas, ChatGPT said that she was a male chief. Now, because we only have one version of a story, one perspective, usually the colonizers were training all of our technology to only have that story. We need to start correcting those mistakes. We need to start sharing all of the stories. A few years ago, I heard a powerful speech by Nigerian writer Chimamanda Adichie, who talks about the danger of a single story, how it leads to dehumanizing people, to perpetuating stereotypes, to denying them their voice and their agency. But she also stated, when we reject the single story, when we realize that there is never a single story about any place, and I would add, or any people, we regain a kind of paradise. And that is my goal today. By sharing these women's stories, though incomplete as they may be, we can begin to see their full humanity, the complexity of women in all of our forms. These women embodied that complexity in the way they lived their lives, in the relationships they built, in the choices they made to bravely face a world that was rapidly changing around them. They were lovers and mothers, sisters and strategists, warriors and ambassadors, all of the things that the great mothers of our origins were, and more. As we come to the end of this presentation, I want you to share the stories that you've heard about these women today. Because by sharing their stories, we're going to start busting many of the myths that come to us from a colonizer's perspective. So many which have been ingrained in our subconscious, which have actually been helping to keep us colonized. By sharing these stories, we're going to be decolonizing our minds. We're going to start healing so many of the wounds within our community. By sharing these stories, you'll be able to heal something deep within yourself, something deep within a friend or a family member. But most important of all, you're going to help heal the future generations. In the meantime, Ta&iacute nagu. Hahom, thank you to our sponsor, The Legend of the Kasike Princess by Michael Dorta. Pick up your copy today and reconnect with the rich legacy of our Taíno people.